Welcome to the first lesson in the Introduction to Interfaces, Classes, and Objects. In this lesson, we'll simply cover our interface. And, of course, we'll create the project that we'll use for the rest of these lessons. So let's begin by first creating a new Java project, which we'll call our randomizer project. Now, we are going to create and model several randomizer objects. A randomizer is anything that could be used in a game to introduce that which is random into the game itself. Most games have some aspect of randomness, and we want an easy way to create this. So, we're going to begin by creating a new interface. An interface is the set of rules or contract for how anything that calls itself a randomizer will interact with our computer code. We're going to call our interface the randomizer interface and click Finish to create our interface. Now notice that what we have here is public, because an interface has to be public for it to be used, and then we have the keyword interface, which defines this. It is not a class. It operates like a class, but it is not really considered a class. And then, of course, we have the name of the interface itself. So, this raises the question, what is a randomizer? Let's start by filling out the java.doc comment for our randomizer, and we'll begin by putting in our name. And then we'll put in a short description. So, what do we talk about when we talk about an interface? This interface describes the methods that are used for any class that will be used in a game to introduce the aspect of randomness. So, let's spell aspect correctly. There we go. So, what do we mean by this? Can we think of some examples? Well, sure. Some examples include the most basic randomizer that almost all of us carry around with us would be a coin that we can flip and get heads or tails. Of course, in many games, you have dice. And another example that's commonly used in a game like Wheel of Fortune or the Game of Life would be a spinner. And then, of course, we have the most commonly used randomizer in Las Vegas, which is a deck of cards. So, next we'll just describe the date when we're beginning to write this, which should be February 9th of 2015. Okay, so now we've documented our very first interface. So that raises the question, well, what is an interface? An interface is a list of methods that any class that is going to call itself a randomizer must have. It is effectively a contract. An interface is a contract that lists the methods that a class must have if it is to be called, if it is to be said to implement that interface. Okay, so now we know what an interface is, and pretty soon we'll see what an interface does. But for now, let's talk about the actual interface for a randomizer. What we want to do is define what are the common things that all of these randomizers, the coin, the dice, the spinner, and the deck of cards, have in common, and describe them in a way that is generic enough that it applies to all of them? Well, of course, one of the things that all of these have in common is that they have some number of discrete values that they can return. A coin can be one of two things. The standard die could be one of six. A spinner, of course, it depends on the spinner itself, but it'll have some number of set values it can return. A roulette wheel has a set number, for example. And, of course, a deck of cards has 52 possible outcomes. Okay, so how are we going to define these methods that we're going to have? Well, the methods are going to fall into two categories. First, we're going to talk about methods that get information about the randomizer. And what's the first getter method that we want to have? Well, first we also want to say that it's going to be a public method, because what would be the point of a non-public interface? The interface, after all, is how the object interacts with the rest of the world. And then what type of value are we going to be returning? Well, we're going to be getting the possible outcomes for this randomizer. And really what we want to know is how many possible outcomes they are, and these are discrete outcomes. So our return type, it makes sense to be an integer. Now, what would be an example? How many discrete possible outcomes would a coin have? 2. How many would a standard die have? 6. How many would a deck of cards have? A standard deck of cards would have 52 possible outcomes. Okay, how about what we also want to know is if I flip a coin, roll a die, or draw a card, I want to know what value it has. And because we're programmers, numbers are going to be the most useful kind of information we can get about any randomizer. So we're going to set up a method that will get the value, the current value, of the randomizer in number form. Now, of course, what is the number value of heads or tails? Well, we as the programmers need to make that sort of arbitrary decision. Which brings us to the question of what is a much more useful to non-programmer way to get a value, and that is to get that same value in string form. So we're going to have public string, and we're going to get the current, and we're going to call the thing that we're seeing the face of the randomizer, whatever that is. Okay, so now we have 3 methods that all gather information about our randomizer, and therefore they're getters. Now, these should be somewhat familiar to you because you've worked with strings, and all of the string methods are getter methods. Substring returns part of a string. Length returns information about the length of the string. Index of tells you where one string is within another string. Okay, so what other kinds of methods are there? Well, the one thing we haven't addressed yet is actually using a randomizer as a randomizer. And to do that, we're going to create another type of method commonly referred to as a setter method or a mutator. Now, what is our mutator method or setter method going to be? Well, we want to take our die and we want to do something to it. Now, it's not returning in any information, so what's the return type going to be for this method? It's simply going to be void because it doesn't actually return any information. It's an instruction to do something. Okay, well, what are we going to call it? If it was a coin, we'd say flip it. If it was a die, we'd say roll it. If it was a card, we'd say draw it. If it was a spinner, we'd say spin it. In all of these cases, what we're actually doing is we're asking our randomizer to randomize itself. In the case of a coin, flip it. In the case of a die, roll it. Oops. In the case of a spinner, spin it. And in the case, well, of a card, we would draw it. Okay, well, guess what? We have just fully described all of the aspects that we need to have a complete randomizer, which means we've written our first interface. In the next lesson, we'll talk about how we use an interface.